Well, good afternoon, family. It's good to be with you again on this Sunday afternoon, 4 o'clock, with Milton, the Doctor Professor Milton Allimadi. And we got a great program for you today. Um, for those who don't know who Professor Milton is, he is a professor of African Studies at the John Jay College in Manhattan here. Um, Milton is the founder and producer of Black Star News. Um, Milton is a graduate of Columbia um, University. Milton just got so many uh, credits to his life.
Thank
He's
you,
a
comrade.
world traveler. He's a researcher. He's a great brother. And I had
Thank
the
you.
opportunity to travel with him to Zimbabwe. And we're going to look at a little of that footage. This is
Sure.
going to take like about 4 parts to go over all of the things that we did in Zimbabwe. But what I'm going to do is to play the footage that we did at the Great Wall. And let me not forget that we got Mama Lioness Moshe with us. So she's co-producing the program today. And we want to start with looking at the Great Wall. So I'm going to ask you to kind of narrate over the footage that people are going to be seeing, but there's some interaction that you do around the Great Wall, which I want to show.
Wow.
Here we go, Milton.
So this is the ancient Great Zimbabwe, one of the wonders of the world. The Great Wall that when the Europeans arrived in the 1890s to take over the land and named it Rhodesia, they concluded that this could have only been built by white people. It's amazing construction. There's no glue, there's no cement, there's no lime holding these stones together. These stones are kept in place by the positioning, by the design. Can you imagine what kind of genius this took? Not to use anything that holds these walls together except for the weights of the stones themselves. Up to 30 feet or more high,
How many feet tall?
30 to 35, 20 to 25 feet thick. And these date 1,000 years old, from the 11th century, when the great kingdom of Great Zimbabwe existed in that part of the world. And they were already engaged in trade with the outside world. They were trading with China. They were trading with Indonesia.
What happened here?
They were trading with
They
Arabia.
wanted to find out whether there was any
So let's
gold
listen to
inside.
what they're saying here for a minute.
A trench was dug from here. You can see the soil here. They wanted to find out whether underneath there, inside there wasn't any gold. That
So
was
this
in
is a guide
1949
explaining.
by a lady archaeologist called Gertrude Catton Thompson.
Talking about archaeologists
Our own
dug
people also
around.
think
And by the
there
way,
some gold there. Then of course the European thought there should be some treasure that supported the growth of Great Zimbabwe.
so
And when
the
they heard
guide
that
is
this
saying, if you
plenty,
didn't hear him,
there was some
that
gold.
Europeans kept digging underneath,
And that
searching for
trench
treasures.
this part of the wall.
Oh,
fact-
that's why the wall began to
Yes.
settle. It
That's
settled
Brother
from the
Clemson
trench.
speaking. Let's listen to him for a
Otherwise,
while.
this conical tower is seen on our $1 coin and on many
What I
other
was saying
objects.
is that I was asking him about the Europeans trying to dig up under the ground to see what was in those those stacks, and they caused walls to re-split after they dug up under it. Here's a coin that was
Yep, that's
found
it.
by one of the reporters who was with us. Uh, but he was saying they were looking for treasures in these large storage bins, but they weren't. They
Okay,
what were
not a
they
problem.
for, Milton? What was these big storage bins? What did they hold?
They hold symbols and signs and sort of their form of scriptures, carvings and paintings. The gold was actually not located near the Great Wall. The gold was at a different distance, which was very smart because even the Arab traders that Great Zimbabwe did commerce with did not know where the gold was located. And that was wise on the parts of the people of Great Zimbabwe because obviously they knew outsiders would have plundered the gold had they disclosed the location of where the gold was.
The TV crew wants to talk to you.
And by the way,
The TV crew.
the Great
Okay,
Wall
brother.
is only one of 300 different findings through the excavations. Of course, it's the most prominent one and it's the biggest one. But there are more than 300 other constructions that do not get enough attention and publicity. And this demonstrates the great level of civilization
I am delighted
that people in that part of Africa
to do it.
had already achieved. The stones that where the elite of the society lived.
Allimadi, stay with me, please.
Yes, I'm with you, brother.
Oh, okay. In the event that he's not.
I was talking about the guide. In the event the guide was not with me,
Just
I
let me
wanted
know
to
when
make
you're ready.
sure that you was there to explain on film what was going on. In the background, that's all the wall that people see back there.
Absolutely.
That's all a part of the wall. It's huge. How far does this wall run? I mean, for that enclosure. And there's several different locations in which they
There's
built.
several locations, as I said, there are more than 300 ruins actually. This, of course, is the largest, and it runs 300 feet long and about 225 feet wide.
No, I'm afraid not.
I'll point it to you.
Okay.
Now, why did they enclose
Yeah, the kind of cross.
their kingdom like this?
Well, it's a way of protection as well. It serves sort of as a fortress as well, but it's also a spiritual symbol. As you see the rise, the iconic rise of the buildings, that also represents spirituality. It was not only for protection, but it also was a spiritual symbol.
What happened?
Point out that there has been a concerted biased media campaign against Mugabe, particularly originating from the United Kingdom, and we understand why. Because for example, the BBC is pretty much an instrument of British government policy, and the British government right now is hostile toward Mugabe. And much of the hostility comes over the land redistribution issue, of course, as we all know. And Mugabe, I guess his position has been that, well, he really can't afford to pay compensation for land which was acquired by force anyway from the beginning. And I think this is actually the opportunity for the British government to step forward and go back to some of the commitments that they made at Lancaster. Come up with the funding if they want these white farmers to be compensated. But my concern was to try and come here and see things for myself, so that when I go back and I write articles or editorials, it would be on a factual basis, not only on an emotional basis. I could tell even before coming here that there was something wrong with the British spin. The negative news was too consistent on a daily basis. that anybody, any thinking person would become suspect. Because despite all the problems that Zimbabwe has right now, compared to so many African countries, Zimbabwe is almost relatively a paradise.
Okay.
Let's be serious.
Oh, yes.
Let's look at places like Liberia. Let's look at places like Sierra Leone. Let's look at places like Cote d'Ivoire right now. Let's look at the DRC. Let's look at places like Uganda, where there's a one-party state, for example. So why is Zimbabwe being picked out and singled as this demon country with a demon president? It's just not, there's no balance. It does not match, and it's completely unfair. And we hope, in our small way, we can, try to change the media coverage in a different direction.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Okay, and as you can see, youth is really wasted on the young people.
Goomba's gonna kill us, man. Let's go.
All right.
Goomba's gonna kill us, right?
Thank you for capturing that moment in history, Comrade Clemson Brown. That, of course, is when we visited Zimbabwe to see for ourselves what was going
Throw
on
that stuff in a suitcase.
when the demonization was
already
escalated after the land reform
I just gotta throw my
went
stuff
into high gear between 2000 and 2002. So Brother Clemson Brown and I, together with City Council member Charles Barron, we were part of a delegation that went to see for ourselves.
Right, the guy has a camera phone.
And Brother Clemson, as you recall, things were not adding up because on the plane from London heading to Zimbabwe, the plane was packed with Europeans.
Correct.
And at that time, they were saying that Europeans are being killed in Zimbabwe. Why would they be packing a plane going back to a place where Europeans are being killed? That is when we started to realize this propaganda was very intense and filled with lies. During our visit to Zimbabwe, we met
number of
ordinary
newspapers.
Europeans.
Yeah,
By
absolutely.
the variety and number of newspapers, opposition, critical media, critical press. You know, you don't even find that kind of diversity in New York, man.
Not only that, we met with them.
We were talking about how we met with both sides, the whites that they claimed were being killed and so forth.
You saying?
No,
And they
it's
were-
balance. Look at this balance.
Wow.
You know, the
This
stone
is
is part of
important.
the wall. It's almost as if it was constructed with welding machine, but there's no cement.
There's no cement, as I said earlier.
But it looks
Oh,
like
man. Yeah, when you really give it the thought.
it was actually not built by human beings. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, they just incorporated all in natural.
Part of the creation.
Yeah.
You know?
And these walls
They
have been here
added-
how long?
800 years is what I understand. They added, look, this is part of,
Actually,
I don't know
1,000.
what your faith is, but this is part of the creation when the earth came into being. This part right here, see? But look how it blends into what was created by man, by African man, as if it were one,
Yeah, that's true.
as if African man actually created this as well. You see
Yeah.
what I'm saying?
Yeah,
No, look, everything here looks natural.
yeah.
Look up that pathway. See?
Right.
See how it
Natural
melds into the
beauty.
wall? See what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
It is
absolutely.
truly remarkable.
Build the wall part. That's scary. It's so impressive, it's scary.
So impressive, it's scary.
Even today, it's scary.
And you know that our culture and history and development was disrupted by colonial rule and slavery. Because otherwise, if we had this kind of technical and scientific expertise at that time, imagine what we could be doing today had our history had not been interrupted by all these travails, plunder, pillage, slavery, massacres, genocide.
What was European history like in culture compared to the time and period that they came here?
Oh, we were too way advanced for them. Obviously, they were shocked when they found these creations here. That's why my understanding from one of the guys is there was the myth created that this whole setting was actually built by a lost European tribe in Africa who somehow have become completely extinct and there's no trace of them. which is nonsense, of course. They tell us that all the time.
Well, how were the Europeans able to dominate and conquer, enslave these Africans if they were that great?
I think it's a mindset. I think if we put this kind of expertise into building this, into building weaponry to go and conquer another people who had not harmed us, it would have been the reverse. We could have done the same thing, colonize Europe. I think it becomes from a different kind of instinct and culture and a mindset. We were not predisposed toward that. I think that's the only difference. So in other words, they put that kind of energy into developing more sophisticated weapons. And that's how they were able to conquer territory and conquer peoples in Africa. That's my explanation.
Thank you. That's a good explanation.
Yeah.
You said Africans had no what?
The other part that I should have also handled was that we also had no need to, resource-wise. We had everything we needed. We were not crammed into these cold, dry countries with winter, harsh weather, minimal land, with growing populations. They didn't have the resources we had, so they had the motivation and inclination to come and conquer.
That's true. Yeah.
What kind of monkey are these?
I can't even add anything to that, Brother Clemson.
Yes, it was such a marvelous and wonderful trip. We were there, I think, were we there 10 days?
Yes, about 10 days, almost 2 weeks, right.
And we went to the, to what they call Victoria
Keep going
Falls.
back.
But what is the name of the African name for Victoria Falls? Because
Mosi
not
Otunya.
What was the name?
Mosi Otunya.
Mosi Atunya. And
Tunya.
it's interpreted.
It means, as you know, the smoke that thunders.
Yeah. So next week, we're going to be showing you a lot more footage, and that's one of the things we're going to look at. We're going to look at the origins of the Nile River. One of the sources of the Nile River is there in Zimbabwe. And that's called the White Nile. And the White Nile runs and meets the Blue Nile coming out of Ethiopia. We'll show that to you next week. And then it travels 4,000 miles, which is the Nile, the length of the Nile, Nile Valley civilization. But that civilization that reaches Egypt and develops Egypt starts from inner Africa, in which Zimbabwe would have been one of the areas that contributed to the great civilization of Egypt. And all along the Nile River during that time, it was just African people. Egypt is a African civilization. So can you speak on that for us, Milton, since we
Yes.
were there?
Yes, and even though, yes, Zimbabwe is all part of that great Rift Valley civilization that actually created Kemet, the civilization. The primary sources of the Nile are found in Uganda and Ethiopia, in the Lake Tana region, in the case of the Blue Nile, and what was called Namlolwe in Uganda for the White Nile, which the Europeans came and they renamed Lake Victoria, as you know, and it's still called Lake Victoria up to date in the 21st century. And as you also pointed out to the audience, we still have a Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, when in fact the true name is Mosi or Tunya. And I think in terms of who were the Egyptians, Dr. Chek Anta Diop was able to prove conclusively that they were a Black African civilization. He was able to prove that conclusively, first of all, by demonstrating that human beings originated in Africa because the first humans had a high melanin content in order to be able to survive in Africa, which at that time, the heat was even much, much more intense than what it is today. And in order for humans to survive, you would need melanin, which of course meant the first humans were all Africans. And then secondly, he was able to demonstrate that of the 6 different gradations of the human evolution prior to Homo sapiens sapiens, the 6 stages are found only in Africa, from stage 1 to stage 6. In Europe and in Asia, you only find stages 4, 5, and 6. And you cannot start a human species from stage number 3 from stage number 4 without 1, 2, 3. And 1, 2, 3 are only found in Africa. In the Americas, we only find stage 6, sapiens sapiens. And then finally, Anta Diop was able to do carbon radiation testing in the laboratory that he set up in the University of Dakar in Senegal, and was able to test mummies from ancient Kemet, aka Egypt. And he was able to establish conclusively that the content level of the melanin found in the remains also proved that those were Black Africans. And so there's no serious person who should still dispute this. But there's still very many, of course. But this goes to the denial, the propaganda that's been established over many centuries. Number one, that Africans could not achieve that kind of high civilization. Number two, that only Europeans could attain that kind of high civilization, even though the question remains, if Europeans were able to build the pyramids in Kemet, why did they not build some in Europe as well, or in Asia, or anywhere else in the world? So I don't think there's any serious debate, but of course there are millions and millions of deniers who find it very difficult to accept the fact that the first human beings in the world were Africans, and that, as Cheikh Anta Diop argued, had they not migrated to Asia, to Europe, and other parts of the world, the so-called Middle East, all human beings would have been Africans. The Africans who migrated to other parts of the world through tens of thousands of years of adaptation to that new environment and that new climatic condition. That is how we ended up having the diversity of populations that we now see today. Not really the diversity of races, because there's only one race, which is the original race from Africa, which then, as I said, adapted to take on different features. So we should refer to diversity of populations around the world, not diversity of races.
Thank you, Milton. In terms of Zimbabwe and why we went to Zimbabwe, can you explain the fact-finding mission, why it was necessary for us to make this fact-finding commission in the first place?
Of course, absolutely. When we went to Zimbabwe, the land reform had already been introduced.
Give us a little of the history of Zimbabwe, how
Absolutely.
it is. Okay, good.
The land was stolen in the 1890s by the Europeans, by the British, who went there and overthrew King Lobengula in 1894, when in fact, this king of the Ndebele had invited the Europeans and granted their wish to search for gold in 1870. Once they determined the wealth, the riches, they decided to get rid of the king. And of course, the people of Zimbabwe fought back, the Ndebele as well as the Shona, and they initially defeated the British, these Europeans, who then sent reinforcement, massive reinforcement, coming from Southern Africa, from South Africa proper. And ultimately, they were able to defeat the people of Zimbabwe and seize the land. The struggle continued, the resistance. It was called the Chimurenga. Chimurenga, of course, means revolutionary struggle. And that is a Shona word. And ultimately, the spiritual leader of the resistance was Nyehanda. And she was ultimately also captured in 1898, together with the king at that time, King Huata. And both of them were executed. And Nyehanda was beheaded, and her skull was taken to the United Kingdom, where it remains up to date in the 21st century. And the people of Zimbabwe have been demanding to have these remains returned so that she can get a proper African spiritual burial and funeral. Well, after the British were able to defeat the resistance in Zimbabwe, they renamed it Rhodesia and took over all the land via ethnic cleansing of the African population. Europeans were invited and they were told, you can ride on a horse for as long as you can. And then when you get tired and you get off the horse, that would mark the boundary of the land that belongs to you. In other words, your limitation is only limited by how far you can ride uninterrupted on a horse. If you can ride for a whole month, certainly that would have been the amount of land that you would own. So that's how the land was taken away. But it's not only the land, the livestock, millions of heads of cattle, of goats, of sheep, of chickens, you name it. Livestock, worth, of course, in contemporary terms, billions of dollars. So we always focus on the land. Yes, of course, the land is the most important, but the livestock was also taken. So in other words, the Africans were impoverished. And then, of course, they were forced to become essentially laborers on farms that used to belong to them. Now they're employees of Europeans. And the Europeans set up this administration, this colonial regime. And then come 1965, the British played another trick. When other African countries had begun to win their independence, rather than granting independence to the Africans in what was then Rhodesia, the British encouraged a white-led coup d'etat. So the white minority, who made up less than 2% of the population, but controlled more than 70% of the land, seized the government and declared what they call a unilateral declaration of independence. Yes, we are now independent from Britain, but the leadership is going to be white, the descendants of the British. In essence, the British declaring independence from themselves. So, of course, it was a scam. And this sparked the African resistance, led initially by Joshua Nkomo, Zimbabwe African People's Union, and then later also Robert Mugabe, who led the Zimbabwe Africans National Union, or ZANU. At some point, they were arrested, incarcerated for years, particularly Robert Mugabe. Nkomo had fled into exile. Mugabe ultimately was also released and also fled into exile. They had launched a guerrilla warfare, and their armies, respectively, the army that belonged to Nkomo's wing was called ZIPRA. Zimbabwe African People's Revolutionary Army, supported by the Soviet Union with weapons, and ZANU, ZANLA, Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, which was the wing led by Robert Mugabe, was supported by the People's Republic of China with weapons. But they got sanctuary in neighboring African countries such as Tanzania. And later on, after it won its independence, Mozambique. They offered them places where they could train their soldiers and where if they needed to withdraw for tactical reasons, they could hit the white regime and then withdraw to the safety of these countries. And Zambia as well offered them safety and training facilities. And they fought this war. And the white minority regime was supported by their kith and kin in the United States and in Europe, particularly Britain. So the United States and Britain became the primary sponsors of this illegal white minority regime. Publicly, they denounced the regime and said it was illegal, but privately, they supported the regime massively, economically, and even diplomatically. They opposed sanctions that could have forced the regime to capitulate within a few weeks. And that is why the war lasted from 1965 until 1979. In fact, there were many Americans, as many as 300 white Americans who had fought in Vietnam, who also went and fought on behalf of the white soldiers in Zimbabwe. They were called the crippled eagles. Crippled meaning that the United States had abandoned them. That's why they call themselves crippled eagles. And out of those 300 white Americans who fought on behalf of the white regime, 7 of them were killed and many, many more of them were wounded. But ultimately, the Patriotic Front, as they call themselves, that's the umbrella organization that united Nkomo's soldiers as well as Mugabe's soldiers. They were able to defeat the white minority regime, and the British, once again, being very cunning, called them for a conference in London. The British did not want them to seize absolute power by force of arms, because then they would be able to dictate their own agenda. So the sneaky British, once again, impressed upon them and put pressure on the African countries that had been supporting the liberation struggle to put pressure on Nkomo and Mugabe and get them to come to London to negotiate the end of this white minority regime. Something that could have been done in 1965 is now being done in 1979. So they went to what was called the Lancaster Conference, and they negotiated the end of the white minority regime. It led to elections, and then Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. And the Patriotic Front won those elections. Initially, 20 seats were reserved in the 100-seat parliament for the white population. I think that was altered about 10 years later when that was changed from the Constitution, and there were no seats reserved for any minority anymore. It was just be openly competitive elections. Now, one thing that also happened at the Lancaster Conference was that the British, together with the United States, assured and committed that they would pay for the land to be bought back from the descendants of the Europeans who stole the land, so that the land could be returned to the Africans. This never happened. The British and the Americans betrayed the Africans in Zimbabwe. And that is why, by the year 2000, they called themselves the war veterans. People who had fought in the liberation struggle said, enough is enough. We fought for the return of the land. And look, this is now 2020. We won the war in 1979, and we still don't have the land. So they started occupying those farms that was under the control of the Europeans. So Zimbabwe and Mugabe had no choice but to go ahead and implement the land reform program, They seized the land, and they said they would not compensate the Europeans whose ancestors, after all, had stolen the land after killing the ancestors of the Africans who now had no land. And as a result of that land reform program, the propaganda was unleashed, the attack, the vicious attacks by the British government and their cousins here in the United States. And we feared that they were actually trying to get other African countries to invade Zimbabwe, which in fact they were trying to do. But Thabo Mbeki, who was the president at that time, refused. The British put a lot of pressure on Mbeki to join them in invading Zimbabwe to reverse this land reform. But to his credit, no matter how much people say that Mbeki had some shortcomings as president, on one issue, it cannot be denied. He stood firm as an African and refused to invade a sister African country in order to take the land from Africans and give it back to Europeans. So that is in a capsule, the history, and you and I, and Brother Charles Barron and others, the late James Davis, of course, council member, as well as State Assemblyman Adam Clayton Paul, and others, we went on this trip to see out for ourselves about this land reform that was going on in Zimbabwe.
Okay. You had some questions for Milton. Please. Is your mic off, Sister Moshe?
I think you're on mute, sister.
Oh, okay.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah, that would help. Okay, so well, actually, after listening and watching the film and listening to your historical narration, you pretty much answered some of majority of my questions. So currently, with the situations in Zimbabwe today, can you give us an update on how the transformation of the government into the hand of leadership is happening now today, and how it's being beneficial?
Okay, thank you for that question, sister. Things are very precarious as we speak in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is very rich in land and natural resources, like pretty much every African country actually is rich land, natural resources, and its population, the people of Africa and Zimbabwe. But Zimbabwe has been under this Western vindictive, punitive sanctions going on 20 years now. Sanctions declared after the land reform was initiated, first by the British, and then the British got their fellow Europeans here in America and other parts of the world, the European Union, to impose these sanctions on Zimbabwe, virtually destroying its economy, so that at one point, in fact, they had to use only the United States currency because Zimbabwe's currency had become worthless due to inflation. They kept putting extra zeros. They had denominations of millions of dollars, banknotes that had no value at all. And this is simply because the people of Zimbabwe stood up and took the land back and gave it to the Africans. So the country is still being impacted by the sanctions. In fact, as you know, it put so much pressure that in 2017, the elements of the Zimbabwe government and the armed forces sort of eased the late Robert Mugabe out of the presidency, and he has been succeeded by Emerson Mnangagwa from the same ruling party, ZANU-PF, and they were hoping that perhaps the West would ease up on those sanctions because the West has sort of personalized the dispute that they had with Zimbabwe and personalized it in the form of Robert Mugabe. He was widely demonized and blamed for the collapse of the economy, when in fact it was due to the sanctions. But ultimately, there's been no change. Comrade Mugabe has now joined the ancestors. He's no longer around. But even then, the Western countries remain so vindictive that they've not removed or lifted the sanctions against Zimbabwe. So this is putting tremendous pressure on the people of Zimbabwe. The only new update I have is that what they call the Southern African Development Community, which is an organization of the 16 countries in Southern Africa, but also going all the way to East Africa because Tanzania is also a member. They've come together with a unified front to demand that the United States, Britain, and the EU lift these sanctions. And they're going to escalate the campaign on October the 25th, which is upcoming, when they'll make another strong statement and start sending diplomats all over the world to publicize the damage that these sanctions are doing, not only on Zimbabwe, but to the entire region of Southern Africa, because Zimbabwe is a major economy. So when you, as they put it, if you kill one part of the human body, it affects the other parts of the human body as well. So that is the update that I can give you on the situation in Zimbabwe.
Okay, so also back in 2018, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but Belarusian official, he was a president of Alexander who secured trade business deals with Zimbabwe, and then in 2021, they had found out about behind the veil offshore deals that were being sanctioned between his son and another well-connected figure, and created this controversial of the gold mining prospects in Zimbabwe. Do you know anything more about that?
Not specifically that particular incident that you described, but without any doubt, the authorities in Zimbabwe have tried every means necessary in order to continue functioning. So I would not be surprised that under those conditions of sanctions, you may find that many what others would consider shady deals to be going on. But in fact, if circumventing these sanctions, you need to do things that ordinarily would not be seen as legal, I don't see that as a very major issue. I only see a major issue when the elite in Zimbabwe use that to benefit themselves and enrich themselves. But if you're using it to bust the sanctions in order to help the population of your country, for example, if that's the only way you can import medicine, I would say go ahead and do it. But if it's, you make me wealthy and I make you wealthy, that of course we don't support. We reject that totally.
So, who's the current president now in
Zimbabwe?
Zimbabwe?
It's Emerson Mnangagwa. And there could be some signs of some easing, because recently, I understand, the United Kingdom invited him. And this is unprecedented, something never done before, to come to London, because there's going to be an international environmental conference. So they've invited him to come to this conference, but this could be an opportunity to have him in a private setting where they can actually start serious talks about how to lift these sanctions. Because even though it's hurting the people of Zimbabwe tremendously, it also hurts the Europeans and the European corporations who are accustomed to making a lot of money by doing business in Zimbabwe.
One of the things that we did when we were there, the government under Robert Mugabe, they allowed us to go anywhere in the country to talk to anybody without restrictions that we wish to talk to get the facts and to understand what was going on in Zimbabwe. We even got an opportunity to speak with the white farmers. And next week, we're going to have all this footage, Milton. So we're going to be
Yes.
looking for you to come back because you interviewed a number of the white farmers. There was one farmer we interviewed that had an ostrich farm.
Yes, yes, yes. I recall.
I bring that up because somebody in the Trump administration was wearing an ostrich suit, if you remember. And so we visit the farm that grew the ostriches that they killed and made cloth material out of. And those suits sell for thousands of dollars. And Trump's supporters, at least one of them, had bought several of those suits. But we talked to the white farmers. We talked to the white farmers union. We brought them to the table where James Davis and
Yes.
Charles Barron was
Yes.
able to negotiate actually a settlement with them. I do believe that when we came back to America, that interview, that negotiation that Davis and Charles Barron did in order in getting the white settlers to literally agree that it was the Americans and the British responsibility to pay them the money in which they had promised they were going to pay them for the land if they moved.
Yes.
And Charles Barron and James Davis showed their negotiating skills and ability to actually handle the white farmers in a more of a equitable but negotiating settlement, and the papers carried it.
Yes, the front pages.
Yeah, in Europe, which they did not appreciate the white farmers making those statements that it was Britain's responsibility to pay them and not Zimbabwe, because that was the Lancaster Agreement.
Yes.
That it would be America and Britain that that paid them for their land.
Yes.
We went on the land where Ian Smith and other whites were still working black workers for little or nothing. And then they were saying that if they left, Zimbabwe would not be able to feed itself because they didn't know how to cultivate and produce the massive crops that the whites were doing. But yet, when we left there, before we left, we went out to see where black farmers had gotten together, and they had acres and acres and acres and acres of land, and they were working collectively, planting different crops, all kind of crops that they needed, and they were doing it as well as any farmer, as well as the whites were doing it, and they were doing it in a collective manner. I was really just impressed to know to see how the Zimbabwe people had come together to show the world that they could do for themselves if only they were left alone. So, you know, before you leave, just kind of give us a summary of that, even though next week we'll have the footage of it.
Okay, and I have one more question as well.
Yes, please, sister, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So is Zimbabwe part of the African Union?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so how are the African Union, supporting Zimbabwe at such a time as this? And with that, I'm
Okay, so
complete.
let me address your question first, and then I'll wrap up as Brother Clemson said.
Okay.
The African Union's budget, the last time I checked, 60% of the budget is funded by the Europeans and by the United States, some by Canada and some by China. So if somebody else sets your budget, you know what that means.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, the African Union has been completely missing in action and toothless when it comes to standing up to the people of Zimbabwe. But luckily, the Southern African Development Community is pretty powerful because it includes South Africa, which of course is powerful.
Mm-hmm.
They're standing up, and I think that will also push the African Union to become much more aggressive in defending the people of Zimbabwe. Now, in terms of what Brother Clemson, you just outlined, I was glad that you mentioned the fact that the people of Zimbabwe were actually already beginning to produce on the land that they had been given. Because, of course, to say that they would not be able to produce without the Europeans is complete nonsense and idiotic for two reasons. Number one, agriculture existed in Africa before agriculture was in Europe. So that of course shows the nonsense, right? And then number two, the people of Zimbabwe had been feeding themselves for centuries before the Europeans arrived. And then number three, even when the Europeans took over the land, who was actually farming the land? It was the Africans, once again. So I just wanted to dispel that nonsense, which you also did a good job in terms of dispelling. And then some of the things we saw, if you remember, we drove for miles and miles at one time. And we were told that all the land we saw after driving for so many miles belonged to a single farmer on one side of the road, as well as on the other side of the road. That's how ridiculous it was. And why is that? It is because a population of less than 2%, as I said earlier, owned 70% of the land. And we were able to see that with our eyes. And you mentioned how we visited the farm that was under the control of Ian Smith. And for listeners that may not be familiar, Ian Smith was the last white prime minister of Rhodesia. He's the one who in 1965 had declared what they call unilateral declaration of independence from Britain. And this is years after the apartheid system in Rhodesia had ended. The country had become Zimbabwe. And even then, his farm had not been seized by the Africans. He still owned the farm. It was still worked by Africans, and he was still making a living and wealth out of their land. And yet at the same time, the Africans were being demonized by the European and the United States press. And you're right, the meeting with the White Farmers Union was very instrumental, because sometimes when you have an intense, contentious situation, you need an outside voice to come and become the mediators. And I think that's where Charles Barron and James Davis were able to fulfill that role. And it was a major concession for the Europeans in Zimbabwe to admit that, yes, the British never delivered on the promises. And that's why it made international news. So sometimes it's very good for us Africans in diaspora to become involved in mediating affairs in African countries. That is a lesson that we can even apply to other situations that are ongoing today on the African continent. I think that should serve as the wrap up, and I look forward to continuing this conversation in the next episode.
Brother Milton,
Yes, sir.
I want to thank you.
It's always my pleasure.
Listen, I don't know how to thank you for your commitment and your work. Um, we will be free. That's the
Absolutely.
that's the way I'm going to end this. We will be free.
We will be free. And our job is to teach the next generation, the youth, that they come from a tremendous background and history. They should never feel that they're second to anybody in the world. And once we convince them of that, there's no stopping them.
Well, can I take this opportunity to acknowledge a question in the comment section? This question comes from Junibug. He says, Dr. Milton Allimadi, were there any African tribe originals to the North Africa? Or is there any evidence that Africans migrated to North Africa from Central and West Africa?
Yes, of course. There's evidence, because the evidence is that the first human beings actually can be traced. If you do like a genetic outline, they would be traced to what is now East and Central Africa, primarily the region of Uganda, Congo, Kenya, Tanzania. So if the first humans were there, it means that humans that existed any other part of Africa or any other part of the world must have originally migrated from the original place where they existed originally. And that certainly was in Black Africa, in East and Central Africa.
Thank you.
Again, Milton, thank you. And to all of our viewing audience, subscribe to Transatlantic Productions. Subscribe to Tapvideo. Hit the button.
Yes. And by the way, it's Comrade Milton or Brother Milton, not Dr. Milton. So from now on, please, Comrade Milton.
Comrade Milton, I appreciate you so much.
Thank you so much. I look forward to next week's conversation.
All right.
All right. Take care, sister, as well.
Bye.
All right, peace.